Picture this, you're a firefighter. It's a normal day at work, and suddenly a teenager walks through the door of your unit, worried in his eyes, clutching an old blanket. What would you think? But what they found under that blanket left everyone in shock. Even the most experienced firefighters couldn't predict this turn of events. What do you think was under that blanket? Write your guesses in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from. Let's find out how far this incredible story flies. Are you ready to find out the truth? Then watch on. The ending will definitely surprise you. The fire station was quiet that evening. The firefighters on duty were getting ready to have a cup of coffee when the door suddenly opened. A teenager, about 15 or 16 years old, walked in, out of breath and agitated. His clothes were a little tattered, and his hands were clutching a large, unsightly blanket. The boy's face expressed a mixture of fear and determination, but his eyes gave away the main thing: something had happened. The firefighters froze, looking at him. Something was definitely wrong. Usually, teenagers come into fire stations asking for help or just out of curiosity, but this guy, he moved carefully, as if hiding something incredibly valuable and important under the blanket. The room fell silent. Tension hung in the air. One of the firefighters, the oldest and most experienced, approached the guy first and asked softly, "What do you have there, son? What happened?" The boy hesitated. His eyes darted around the room, as if he wasn't sure whether to reveal himself or not. It seemed as if every word he said was worth its weight in gold, as if he was afraid that confessing would change everything. He clutched the blanket even tighter to himself, as if protecting his secret from the outside world. The firefighters waited patiently. It's a child," the teenager finally whispered, swallowing hard around the lump in his throat. "I found her. She was alone. I couldn't just leave." The room froze. The firefighters, who had not expected this turn of events, immediately perked up. A child? The word echoed through their thoughts. The teenager carefully unfolded the blanket. And what did they see? Under the blanket, in a chaos of rags and old fabric, lay a tiny baby girl. She wasn't crying, she wasn't making a sound, but her face, tiny and helpless, expressed a mixture of fear and exhaustion. The firefighters were dumbfounded. The baby looked like she was only a few days old. Her skin was cold to the touch, and she was barely breathing. The firefighters knew that every second mattered. "Where did you get it?" the senior fireman asked tensely, feeling as if time had slowed down. The guy froze, his eyes filled with tears. "I found her on the street," he said hoarsely. "I was just walking home and I heard this faint crying. When I got closer, I saw a box. She was lying there all alone. I didn't know what to do. I thought the fire department might be able to help." These words pierced the hearts of those present. Everyone realized that the teenager, despite his fear and ignorance, made the right choice. He did not leave the baby to die on the street. He did not pass by, as many could have. He took on a responsibility that, in fact, did not belong to him, and brought the girl to a safe place. The baby was immediately examined and paramedics were called. The firefighters acted quickly and in a coordinated manner, although their heads were still full of questions. Who could have left a newborn girl on the street? And what would have happened to her if this guy hadn't been in the right place at the right time? "You did the right thing," the senior firefighter finally said, putting his hand on the boy's shoulder. "You saved her life." But the story didn't end there. The firefighters couldn't just leave it at that. They launched an investigation to find out where the girl had come from and who might have abandoned her. Every hour counted. The baby's health was poor and her condition was getting worse. The teenager stood to the side, watching as the life of the little creature he had found was saved. He couldn't take his eyes off the girl. There was something more than relief in his eyes. It was determination, a willingness to go the extra mile for this child. Meanwhile, the firefighters, still shocked by the incident, understood one thing: this story touched their hearts. But the whole city would soon learn about the heroism of a simple teenager who was not afraid to take responsibility for someone else's life. As the firefighters continued to fuss over the baby, the teenager stood by, feeling his pulsing emotions give way to something deeper: anxiety and confusion. All he wanted was to help. But as the shrieks of radios filled the air and the sounds of ambulance sirens drew closer, he sensed that this was just the beginning of something much more complicated. When the medics took the baby, the firefighters started asking questions. At first, everything was quite neutral. Where did you find her? What did you do right after that? But then some of the questions began to sound different. Are you sure you found her? One of the firefighters asked, leaning toward the teenager with a look of disbelief in his eyes. Isn't she your sister or something? The teenager was taken aback by the question. His gaze darted from the firefighters' faces, and he suddenly realized that some of them were starting to look at him differently, as if his intentions were being called into question. Even though he had done nothing but save the life of a newborn girl, he tried to answer calmly. No, I don't know her. I just found her on the street. But the atmosphere had changed. He saw their glances becoming more and more suspicious. One of them was whispering to a colleague. The other was looking at the teenager as if he were a criminal, not a savior. Words were unnecessary. The boy knew what they were thinking. No matter how hard he tried to explain that he was acting from his heart, the heavy silence made it clear that they were looking at him not just as a teenager, but as a black teenager, and that suddenly changed everything. Listen, one of the firefighters began, coming closer and lowering his voice. Do you understand that if you don't tell me everything, it can backfire? Things like that don't go unnoticed. You can end up in big trouble. I'm not lying, the teenager exclaimed, defending himself. I couldn't just leave her there on the street. The fireman nodded silently, but his face remained cold. It was as if the boy had run into an invisible wall. He suddenly felt that he was now not only trying to save a child, but also had to protect his own name, as if helping him was somehow suspicious by default. The police soon arrived, and here everything went according to a completely different scenario. The police, barely looking at the teenager, immediately approached him with questions. They began questioning him as a witness, but their intonations also sounded harsh, as if they were waiting for him to confess to something more serious. Where were you before you found the child? The officer asked coldly. Can you back up your words? Are there any witnesses? Each question was a challenge. The teenager increasingly felt that his words were not being taken seriously. And it wasn't just the baby. He knew there were other forces at play. Forces of bias that were quietly but inexorably beginning to creep into the situation. He was a black boy in a tough neighborhood, and that was the basis for doubt, even though his actions were pure and sincere. I just found her, he repeated again, his voice shaking slightly. Isn't that important? The policeman wrote down his statement, but his gaze remained stern, as if they were waiting for the boy to start stumbling over his words or admit to lying. And although the little girl was taken to the hospital, the teenager remained there, surrounded by misunderstanding and distrust. But the mistrust of him only grew. Later, when the story became known in the area, news of it spread not so much as about a heroic act of a teenager, but about a suspicious find. Doubts slipped through the comments, social networks, and even in conversations between residents. Why did he find her? How did he know her? It seemed that his race was becoming part of the story. As the world around him became engulfed in discussion, the teenager felt increasingly alone. A fire of mistrust, based on prejudice and stereotypes, was raging around him. It seemed that his actions, no matter how noble, could not be accepted without a shadow of a doubt, simply because of the color of his skin. A few days later, when the teenager tried to visit the girl in the hospital, he was stopped at the entrance. The nurse looked at him coldly, as if she had already heard her side of the story. Sorry, but you won't be allowed in, she said sternly. We have instructions. Why? I just wanted to know how she was, he began, but the nurse, not letting him finish, looked away. It's none of your business, she added firmly. You'd better leave. The boy felt his heart sink. Doors were closing in front of him, and people he didn't even know were building walls of suspicion around him. What was this? Why had his life-saving act become a question of his honesty and intentions? He left the hospital with a heavy heart. This story was now about more than just saving a baby. It was a reflection of what he faced every day, a world that viewed him through the lens of stereotypes, where his good deeds were always questioned simply because he was different from the crowd. The teenager walked slowly through the deserted streets, thinking about what had happened. The city that had once seemed like home to him now seemed to push him away. He couldn't understand how it was that saving a child had turned against him. Everything he had done was right. He couldn't just walk by, couldn't leave the girl in danger, but now he felt trapped by his own good intentions. The next day, his house was surrounded by reporters. The story had spread across the news, and journalists were eager to interview the mysterious teenager who had found the baby on the street. All this fuss only increased his inner anxiety. He didn't want attention. He didn't seek fame, he just wanted the truth to prevail. But something in the air told him that the truth was not always accepted as easily as he would like. First, the police knocked on his door. They didn't accuse him directly, but their questions were again sharpened by suspicion. How did you end up on that street? Why were you alone? It was as if they were trying to find a reason to turn him into a criminal. Each new interrogation only increased his sense of hopelessness. But the worst thing happened a few days later. One evening newscast exploded with the headline, "Teenager who found baby suspected of kidnapping." The guy froze in front of the TV, not believing his eyes. The news anchor was telling how the police had received an anonymous tip indicating that the teenager might have been involved in the girl's disappearance, and now his actions were the subject of an investigation. It's not true," he croaked, but no one heard him. Despair overwhelmed him. How could this happen? He just wanted to help, and now he was being accused of kidnapping. He couldn't even understand where these accusations came from, but the worst was yet to come. A few hours later, as he sat at home trying to collect his thoughts, there was another knock on the door. This time, the police had arrived with a warrant for his arrest. His mother, confused and scared, tried to defend her son, but their voices fell on deaf ears. The teenager was roughly led out of the house, handcuffed in front of all the neighbors, who watched the whole scenario with bewilderment and whispers. He heard someone in the crowd shout, "I knew there was something wrong with him." The words hit him hard in the heart. One thought was spinning in his head. How is this possible? Why, when you do good, do people still judge you by your appearance? When he was taken to the station, the atmosphere was tense. During questioning, the police unceremoniously announced that they had received an anonymous statement from a witness who claimed to have seen the teenager with the girl in question, and although the evidence was flimsy and proof was virtually non-existent, amid public and media pressure, the police decided to act quickly. Once again, his race played a role. A black teenager in a poor neighborhood could not count on the presumption of innocence. But suddenly, at the most difficult moment, a turn occurred that no one expected. When it seemed that the truth would be drowned in lies and stereotypes, a woman entered the police station. She was pale, with tear-stained eyes, and nervously clutching a bag in her hands. Her appearance immediately attracted the attention of everyone present. She was the mother of the very girl the teenager had found on the street. She approached the police officers with difficulty and began to speak in a trembling voice. "It's not him. I know you suspect him, but it's not him. I left the girl myself." The room froze. The policeman looked at the woman, dumbfounded. Her confession was like a bolt from the blue. The woman, sobbing, continued, "I was desperate. My life was falling apart. I had lost my job. My husband had left. I didn't know how to cope with the child. I was broken, and then, in one terrible moment, I made a terrible decision. I abandoned my daughter on the street, thinking that someone else could take better care of her than I could." Her words echoed around the room. The elderly policeman standing behind the desk remained silent as the woman continued. "This guy, he's innocent. He saved my daughter. If it weren't for him, I don't know what would have happened to her. But now I realize that what I did was monstrous, and I have to live with it. But he's a hero, not a criminal." Her confession turned the case on its head. The police were forced to release the teenager, even though his name had already been blackened in the news. He left the station still stunned by what had happened, but more importantly, he felt that even though the truth had been revealed, the wounds inflicted by society would remain for a long time. Over the next week, the story took a new turn. Now reporters tried to fix the situation by turning the teenager into a hero who saved the baby. But it didn't matter to the boy anymore. He realized that the world was unfair and that his appearance and background would always be a factor in how people perceived him. This incident taught him a lesson that left a deep scar on his soul. He realized that even though the truth may prevail, racial prejudices continue to live in the hearts of many people. And although he won this battle, He would have to face many more times how society judges people not by their actions, but by how they look. But despite this, he decided not to give in. This experience only strengthened his resolve to fight for justice without giving up and not to let the world break his spirit. The days after his release were a blur for the teenager. His name was still on the news, though he was now being hailed as a hero, but that didn't bring him any relief. Every time he went out on the street, he felt eyes on him. Some looked at him with respect, others with curiosity or doubt. Although the police cleared him, there were still traces of suspicion in many people's eyes. He knew they thought more about his race than what he had done. At school, the situation was no better. Some classmates who hadn't noticed him before now looked at him furtively, whispering behind his back. The teachers tried to speak to him more sympathetically, but their sympathy felt artificial, as if they didn't know how to behave with a teenager who had found himself at the center of a scandal. "Hey, hero, how's your newborn?" Someone called out in the hallway as he passed. The teenager pretended not to hear. He began to withdraw into himself, avoiding unnecessary conversations. Even his mother, who had supported him during interrogations and the police, noticed the change in her son. One evening, she sat next to him on the sofa, gently placing her hand on his shoulder. "You do realize that people can be unfair sometimes, right?" she said quietly, her voice full of concern. "But you did the right thing. You saved the child, and that's the most important thing." The teenager nodded, but inside him, other emotions were battling. He understood his mother's words, but when confronted with the reality of how people were quick to believe the worst because of the color of his skin, he couldn't just forget the experience. Then one evening, when he went back to the small grocery store on the corner of their street, something unexpected happened. As he stood at the checkout, a stranger approached him, a white man, about 40 years old, with a rough face and haggard eyes. The teenager felt a growing sense of anxiety, remembering all the past incidents when strangers approached him with ill intentions. The man, noticing his tension, nodded to him and said quietly, "You're the guy who found the girl, right?" The teenager nodded slowly, not knowing what to expect. The man held his gaze for a moment, and then, as if gathering his courage, said, "Look, don't think everyone is like that. I've seen the news. I've heard what they say about you. But you've done more than most people would have done. Most people would have just passed you by. That's what I wanted to say." These words sounded like something unexpected. The teenager did not expect that someone would come to him to support him. He did not know how to react and simply nodded briefly, unable to find words. The man nodded again and left, leaving the teenager standing there, comprehending what had happened. This little incident may not have changed the world, but it gave the teenager a sense that, amidst all the prejudices and stereotypes, there are still people who can see beyond the surface, people who don't judge by the color of their skin or the headlines in the news. A few weeks later, the teenager received a letter that truly changed his perception of the whole situation. The letter contained gratitude from the baby's mother herself, the same woman who had first run away, leaving her daughter behind, and then found the strength to confess. In the letter, she wrote, "I know words can't undo what I did. I know I failed my daughter, myself, and you, but I want you to know that because of you, my daughter is alive. I can't thank you enough for what you did. You saved my family, and I am forever in your debt." The letter was short, but it was sincere. After reading it several times, the teenager felt some of his pain go away. He did not expect forgiveness from the world, but the realization that his action had actually saved a life brought him inner peace. However, the story did not end there. A few days after receiving the letter, there was a knock on his door. There were two people in business suits standing on the threshold, and although they looked serious, there was no coldness in their eyes that the teenager was used to seeing in the faces of government officials. "We represent a human rights organization," one of them said, handing over a business card. "We heard your story and want to offer you help." The teenager looked at them incredulously, not understanding what they meant. "We see that your situation has attracted a lot of attention, but unfortunately your name was tarnished before you were exonerated." The man continued, "Our organization is dedicated to supporting young people who have faced injustice and prejudice. We want to help you restore your good name and perhaps tell your story to a wider audience." The words were a breath of fresh air. The teenager realized he had a chance not only to justify himself to society, but also to raise important questions about how bias and racism often distort people's perceptions. He felt he could use his story not as a reminder of pain, but as a tool for change. He agreed to cooperate with human rights activists, and his story began to spread across the country in a new context. He was no longer perceived as a suspect or a hero with a questionable past. He was seen as a young man who had faced injustice but had not broken. The teenager's story became a reminder that racism and stereotypes can break lives, but also that every person has the ability to resist and find the strength to fight for the truth. It was his first step toward a more just society, and while there was much work ahead, he knew his voice was now louder than ever. It had been months since the teenager had come to light with his story, but instead of feeling relieved, he found himself at the center of a new wave of negativity. Despite help from human rights activists and attempts to clear his name, many people still viewed him as a suspect rather than a hero. The internet and social media were proving to be a cruel place. Posts with hateful comments and accusations were everywhere. Some users posted false stories, claiming that he was involved with criminal gangs, that he knew about the abandoned baby in advance, and that the whole thing was a staged effort to get attention. The teenager tried to ignore it, but over time the pressure became too much. Every time he opened his phone, his gaze was met with a new stream of insults. Social media, which had once seemed like innocent fun, now turned into a constant reminder that the world would never look at him objectively. Things didn't get any easier at school either. Some of his former supportive classmates began to distance themselves, afraid of being the ones being bullied. He had no close friends left, and the teachers who had once tried to care now looked at him with the same wariness as everyone else. Every morning became a torment, and the teenager began to seriously consider dropping out of school. One evening, when his mother returned from work, she noticed that her son seemed depressed. She tried to talk to him, but he avoided frank conversations. He knew that she was worried about him, but he did not want to burden her with his thoughts. Deep down, he felt completely alone, despite all the efforts of those around him to help. But the dramatic turn came when one evening a car pulled up to their house and a stranger appeared on the threshold. It was a man of about 40, with a serious and tired face, who introduced himself as a private detective. "Can I talk to your mother?" he asked the teenager. A few minutes later, they were sitting in the living room. The detective began to explain that he had been hired by independent journalists to investigate the truth about that very girl. His words shocked the teenager's mother. "Your son was drawn into a more complex game than you can imagine," the detective said with a heavy sigh. "We found out that the anonymous evidence against him was fabricated. Someone was deliberately trying to harm your son." With these words, he put a folder with photographs and printed articles on the table. The teenager and his mother looked at each other. They could not believe their ears. "But why?" the mother asked, her voice shaking with anxiety. "Why are they doing this?" The detective nodded, as if expecting this question. "When your son found the child, he wasn't just at the center of a random incident. The thing is, this girl, she wasn't left there by her mother's will. We suspect that we're talking about a more serious criminal network connected to child trafficking. Your son was a random bystander, and they tried to make him the scapegoat." The teenager's mother couldn't believe what she was hearing. Child trafficking? Her son had accidentally found himself in the middle of something so monstrous? "We're already working with the police," the detective continued, "but there are people who want this case to never go to trial. That's why they started a campaign to discredit your son. It was in their interests for the public to perceive him as guilty, to divert attention from the real criminals." These words struck the teenager in the heart. Now everything fell into place. Random accusations, online hatred, mistrust from others. This was not just a consequence of stereotypes. It was a carefully planned operation, the purpose of which was to destroy his reputation and divert attention from the real culprits. From that moment on, the teenager's life changed even more. He now knew that his safety was at risk. He and his mother could no longer feel safe in their own home. The human rights activists and lawyers they were working with began to develop a plan to protect the family, and the teenager was temporarily moved to another city, away from danger. But even in hiding, he couldn't stop his thoughts. Everything that had happened to him had made him see the world in a completely different way. He was just a teenager who wanted to do a good deed, but he found himself in the middle of complex social and criminal games. He saw how easily the truth could be distorted and how deep racial prejudice could run. A few weeks later, the news exploded again. The police had arrested a group of people involved in child trafficking, and the girl's mother was among them. It turned out that she was not as harmless as she had seemed at first. She had been part of a criminal scheme, but at the last moment she had succumbed to the pressure and given herself up, leaving the child behind in a desperate attempt to survive. All this time, the teenager had been part of a huge machine of lies, fear and crimes that he had not even suspected. Now his story was growing with new facts, and the truth was gradually coming out. But even when justice began to prevail, the teenager understood that his life would never be the same. In the eyes of society, he was still the guy whose guilt was first hastened to be proven and then acquitted. And although the criminals were arrested, the aftertaste of everything that had happened remained. The stereotypes and suspicions that surrounded him from the very beginning did not disappear along with the arrests. Now he knew that the fight for truth was not only a battle with the system, but also with the consciousness of people. He understood that there was still a long way ahead, but he was ready to go through this path, realizing all the complexity and injustice of the world around him. And even though the pain of betrayal and hatred would remain with him, he decided not to give in. In his soul burned the determination to fight for the truth, not only for himself, but also for those who had also become victims of the system. Despite the arrests and revelations, the teenager was still haunted by the feeling that this story was far from over. He lived in a new city under protection, but every day he looked over his shoulder, expecting another blow of fate. Fear became his constant companion, and although he tried to remain calm on the outside, a hurricane raged inside him. A few weeks after the arrests, when everyone had begun to forget about his case, his mother received a strange letter. It was unsigned and made no threats, but its meaning was clear. "You haven't seen everything. Beware." The words carried an ominous tone, like a warning that their nightmare was just beginning. The teenager's mother, alarmed by the letter, tried to contact the detective who was handling their case, but it turned out that he had been found dead under mysterious circumstances. The official version was suicide, but doubts grew within the family. Was it really a coincidence? Too many strange things had happened in their lives since the teenager found the baby. A little more time passed, and one evening, when the teenager returned home after a walk, he noticed something strange. The door of the house was slightly open, although he clearly remembered closing it when he left. Inside, there was chaos. Books from the shelves were lying on the floor, documents were scattered all over the table, and on the wall someone had left a note in red paint. "This does not concern you." His mother was shocked. She wanted to call the police immediately, but the teenager sensed that this was much deeper than just a break-in. It was a warning, and it was aimed at him personally. Someone didn't want him to dig any further. That night was a turning point for them. They realized that those behind the child trafficking ring had not yet been caught. And, even more alarmingly, their target was now a teenage witness who had accidentally gotten in the way of this criminal network. The next few weeks were a nightmare. They had to move again, but even in the new place they did not feel safe. Strange phone calls, cars slowly driving past the house, strangers who seemed to appear randomly on the streets nearby. All this suggested that they were still being followed. The police provided protection, but the tension grew with each passing day. One night, a teenager was awakened by a knock on his window. It was a baby crying. He jumped out of bed, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked out the window and saw a figure in the darkness holding a small bundle. It was like the day he found the baby, but this time it looked much more menacing. The teenager's heart sank. He didn't know what to do: open the window to help, or run away. Inside him, there was a fierce battle between fear and the desire to save someone who might need help. He decided to call his mother, but when he turned around, the figure at the window had disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. The next day, a black car pulled up to the house. Two men in suits got out and rang the doorbell. They introduced themselves as federal investigators, saying they were investigating human trafficking and that their case had taken on national significance. They warned that the danger was still there, but they had new information in their hands. The men showed photographs in which the teenager recognized those who had already been arrested, as well as several others who were still at large. One of them was a high-ranking politician whom the teenager had seen on television before. "This man is behind everything," one of the agents said, pointing to the photo. "He's doing everything he can to keep the whole scheme from being exposed, and that's why you've become a target." Hearing this, the teenager felt like the world was crumbling around him. Everything he had done to help that baby had now landed him in the middle of a huge criminal network that involved people at the very top of the government. He knew that from this moment on, his life would never be the same. He and his mother were trapped in a death trap that would not be easy to escape from. A few more days passed. Late one night, as the teenager was trying to sleep, the lights suddenly went out in the house. Footsteps sounded on the porch in the darkness. He froze, listening to the sounds, and then heard the door slowly open. For a moment, all the fear that had built up over the past months washed over him, but then he felt something snap inside him, a determination to fight. He quietly walked to the closet and picked up the phone, dialing security, but there was no answer. Panic began to form in his head. He knew he had to protect his mother, that the danger was closer than ever. As the footsteps got closer, the teenager noticed a glimmer of light through the window. Several black cars surrounded the house. It was the police. They burst in at the very moment when a stranger with a gun appeared on the threshold of their home. The arrest was swift. The stranger was the same politician who was involved in child trafficking. He knew the investigation was about to fall on him and decided to eliminate the teenager so as not to leave a single witness. That night, the teenager realized that his fight was not in vain. His actions, his courage and determination not only saved that baby, but also helped expose the entire criminal network involved in child trafficking. The case shook the community, causing a powerful wave of protests against the corrupt system that allowed such crimes to happen. But the teenager knew that even though he had won, he and his family would have to live with the consequences of this story for the rest of their lives. The stereotypes and prejudices that surrounded him still remained, but he was a different person now, stronger, more determined, and ready to fight for the truth, no matter how painful it was. He decided that he would use his story as a weapon against injustice, to help others who found themselves in similar situations. And although the path ahead was difficult and dangerous, the teenager was no longer afraid. He knew that the truth was worth any price. Despite the arrest of the perpetrators, the teenager's life did not return to normal. The child trafficking story shook the country, and the arrest of a high-ranking politician stirred up the public and raised many questions. However, even after such a large-scale exposure, the teenager remained in the shadows. In the eyes of many, he was not a hero, but a target for prejudice, criticism, and racial stereotypes. Although he received temporary protection from the police, the wave of hatred in society did not subside. Now it was not just anonymous comments on the internet, but real threats and public accusations. People were divided into two camps. Some supported the teenager and admired his courage, while others saw him as a symbol of the inconvenient truth about racism in society and how quickly people are ready to judge by appearances without delving into the essence of events. It was particularly hard to see how one local group, far-right activists, began to exploit his story for their own ends. They spread fake news, claiming that the whole situation was fabricated and that the teenager himself was allegedly connected to criminal elements. Racist slogans appeared on the walls of his school, and cartoons depicting him as a threat to society were distributed on social media. One morning, he came to school and saw his locker covered in offensive graffiti. The word criminal and racist remarks were obvious. Teachers tried to ignore it, and school administrators did not respond appropriately. Fearing to cause an even bigger scandal, the teenager realized that even after his acquittal, society was still not ready to accept him as an equal. His skin remained the main argument in the eyes of those who did not want to see him as a person. He tried to talk to the principal, but she, trying not to get involved in the scandal, said only one thing: "We do everything possible to keep the school safe, but such situations are difficult to control. Try to just ignore it." These words cut the teenager to the heart. Just ignore. How can you ignore when you are humiliated every day for who you are? Then he realized that he could no longer sit and remain silent. From that day on, He decided to fight for himself and for everyone who suffered from injustice and racism. He contacted the human rights activists who had helped him before and suggested creating a public campaign against racial discrimination in schools and social networks. He wanted his story to become a symbol of the fight for the rights of those whom society tries to push into the shadows. At one of the meetings with activists who agreed to support him, the teenager shared his true feelings for the first time. He told how he had faced prejudice because of the color of his skin since childhood, how he was looked at askance in stores, how he was checked more often than others, and how people judged his actions based on stereotypes rather than facts. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through," he said at the meeting, his voice filled with pain and determination. "We need to change the way society views people like me. I'm not a criminal. I'm not a threat. I'm a human being." Those words touched many. People began to support him, and soon his story took on new dimensions. Several major news outlets ran stories about how racism continues to ruin lives even when the truth comes out. The teenager's story became the poster child for a problem that was deeper than one exposed crime. But with the new wave of support came new threats. Strange cars began to pull up to his house again, and his mother noticed suspicious people on the street following their movements. One day, they received a package containing newspaper clippings and a photo of his family with the caption, "This is not the end." The teenager knew his struggle was not over, but he was now confident that he was on the right path. He soon received an invitation to appear on television and tell his story to a wider audience. This was a turning point. Speaking live on air, he not only talked about finding the baby and surviving all that danger, but also about how systemic racism has touched every aspect of his life. From his school years to now, he talked about how being black in today's world means constantly proving your innocence, your right to exist, even when you do the right thing. His speech had the effect of a bombshell. Social media filled with supportive comments, and his story became a symbol of a new wave of movement against racial injustice. But the threats also intensified. Some of those who had been behind the teenager's discrediting weren't ready to give up. They were still protected by power and money, and they were intent on silencing him. One night, as the teenager and his mother were driving home, their car crashed. On a deserted road with no witnesses, their car was cut off by another car, and they almost died. At the hospital, where they were taken with minor injuries, the teenager realized that this was no accident. It was a warning. They were trying to scare him, to make him give up his fight. But instead of giving up, the incident only strengthened his resolve. The teenager realized that he could no longer live simply for himself. He had become a symbol of something bigger. His story was no longer just about him. It was the story of everyone who had ever suffered injustice. He realized that the people behind the criminal network and those who spread hatred were afraid of one thing, the truth. Afraid that the truth, revealed to the world, would destroy the walls of racism, prejudice and injustice that they had spent years building. Now his mission was clearer than ever. He would keep speaking out, keep fighting, even if it cost him everything, because every time he went out on the street, he saw the same pain and injustice he had faced in other people's faces, and now he knew he had the power to change that. So his story became more than just a fight for justice in one particular case. It became a movement for equality, for the right of every person to be heard and protected, regardless of the color of their skin. After the accident, the teenager realized that the fight had reached a new, more dangerous level. He and his mother found themselves in the middle of a powerful standoff with forces that seemed to have unlimited resources and influence. But he couldn't give up on his mission. As soon as they left the hospital, they met with lawyers and civil rights groups to bolster their defense. They were about to do what seemed impossible, expose the entire web of corruption that not only covered up child trafficking crimes, but also affected the lives of people across the country through systemic racism. At the same time, the pressure on them continued to mount. A whole campaign to discredit the teenager was organized. Newspapers financed by those behind the criminal network began publishing articles in which he was presented as a rebel who allegedly distorted the facts for personal gain. False stories about his past, that he was allegedly connected to criminal groups, and even that the whole story of the found baby was a setup to raise a fuss, were spread on social media. These false accusations damaged his reputation. But what's worse, they divided society. Some of those who had previously supported him began to waver. The media began to ask, maybe he really is just looking for attention? Is it possible that this whole story is part of a more complex political game? At such moments, the teenager felt more alone than ever. Even his closest friends began to distance themselves from him, fearing for their safety or succumbing to the pressure of public opinion. But there was another, even more disturbing manifestation of racism: the refusal to support him because of the color of his skin. Many people he tried to win over refused, not wanting to be associated with a black guy who causes trouble. These words, spoken behind his back, were especially painful. Despite the fact that he acted for justice, society continued to judge him by his appearance, not by his actions. That's when an unlikely ally emerged, a powerful black lawyer named Marcus Smith, who had previously worked in civil rights and fought racial discrimination in the courts. He knew that the teenager's case went far beyond a single crime. It was a symbol of how easy it is to fall victim to a system that doesn't conform to its unspoken rules. Marcus took on the case with incredible energy. He organized a team of investigators, journalists and lawyers who began to dig deeper. They discovered that behind the accusations against the teenager were not only those involved in child trafficking, but also high-ranking figures from the police and political circles. It was all part of a well-planned operation to protect the privileges of those at the top of the power pyramid. It was corruption, riddled with racism, masquerading as justice and order. Meanwhile, the teenager continued to participate in public events, where he spoke about racial discrimination, injustice, and how the system still only pays attention to you when you break its laws or become a danger to its well-being. His speeches ignited not only sympathy, but also anger among those who believed that the time for change was long overdue. Protests began on the streets of cities, organized in support of the teenager and his fight against systemic racism and corruption. But in the midst of all this, something happened that no one expected. One night, the teenager received an anonymous message. It contained information that one of the leading figures in the child trafficking network, who had been on the run until now, was willing to testify against her accomplices, but on one condition: she would only agree to speak with the teenager. It was an incredible turn of events that opened up new possibilities, but also carried enormous risks. Agreeing to such a meeting meant putting oneself in even greater danger. Marcus and the other lawyers were categorically against it, but the teenager felt he had no choice. If he did not agree, the truth might remain hidden. On the appointed day, he secretly arrived at the meeting place, which was organized under strict security measures. At first glance, it looked like an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city, but the teenager understood that one of the most important moments of his life would unfold here. When he walked inside, he was met with an unexpected scene. The woman he recognized from the photographs, the same figure involved in the child trafficking, was sitting in a dark corner of the room. She looked scared and tired. She told him that the entire network was part of a huge international operation, supported at the highest levels, and that she had been silenced by threats to her family. But the most shocking thing was that it wasn't just criminals who were behind it all, but also public advocates of human rights, politicians, and even media figures who defended the privileged classes under the guise of good intentions. The conspiracy was so deep that for a moment the teenager felt he would never be able to defeat the system. But then she said the phrase that changed everything: "You have the power they fear most." That's true. She handed him documents that could have brought down the entire network if they had fallen into the right hands, but getting them meant that his life was now in even greater danger. Once he left that building, he would be pursued not only by criminals, but also by people in power who would do anything to maintain their positions. When he returned to Marcus and his team of lawyers with this evidence, a new phase began. They realized that with this material they had the opportunity to expose the entire network. But now the danger was more real than ever. Every step forward was fraught with risk, and the pressure from all sides was only increasing. The teenager realized that his mission was no longer just a personal struggle. It was a battle for the thousands of people whose voices had been silenced by systemic racism, for those who had been unfairly accused, betrayed, and used. He was ready to go all the way, knowing that the truth could break down even the most impenetrable walls. Thus began the final stage of their struggle, a struggle not only for justice, but also to change the system itself, which for decades had hidden its dirtiest secrets behind the shiny facades of law and order and power. When the teenager and his team began working through the documents they received from a woman involved in the crime ring, they realized it was just the tip of the iceberg. Each piece of paper represented a complex web of connections, with high-ranking officials, politicians, and even law enforcement officials all involved in child trafficking. It was a grim and shocking revelation that showed how deeply entrenched the corruption was in the system. The teenager, overwhelmed by the amount of information he had to deal with, began to feel the pressure mounting. Every time he opened a file, he realized that his life was at risk of becoming part of a much larger picture, one in which power and money came first, and the lives of ordinary people had no meaning. He shared this information with Marcus and his team of lawyers, but soon they all realized that they had to act fast. With each passing day, their safety became more and more vulnerable. They began to receive threats, and many suspicious people appeared in their lives, watching their every move. One of the lawyers working with the teenager went missing one evening when he was leaving the office. This became an alarm signal for the entire team. The teenager felt that the game was getting out of control, and the question was not whether they would achieve justice, but whether they would survive. At this time, Marcus organized a meeting with the media to get the information out into the open. However, when they gathered at the editorial office of one of the largest news channels, an unexpected turn occurred. While discussing the strategy for the release of the materials, a group of people dressed in black entered the office. At first, the teenager thought they were security, but then realized that these people definitely did not look friendly. One of them, a tall man with dark glasses, stepped forward and introduced himself as a private investigator hired to investigate the illegal activities of the teenager and his group. He claimed that they did not have permission to disclose confidential information and that all of the information was a lie. The lawyers who spoke on behalf of the teenager began to object, but were quickly cut off by threats. Feeling threatened, the teenager decided it was time to act. He quickly picked up the phone and tried to contact Marcus. However, at this point, another unexpected turn occurred. One of the members of the legal team, who seemed to always be on their side, suddenly sided with the people who had come. He admitted that he worked for one of the organizations involved in the criminal network, and now he had to stop them at any cost. This betrayal shocked the teenager and everyone who was at the meeting. Realizing that their plans were falling apart, the teenager and Marcus quickly left the office, and several other lawyers joined them. They knew that they could no longer stay in one place, but when they went outside, another surprise was waiting for them. The cars parked along the road were full of people ready to stop them. At this point, the teenager felt that the situation was becoming critical. As soon as they started running, they were surrounded, and the teenager desperately tried to figure out what to do. He remembered that he had a copy of all the materials they had collected, and he realized that this might be their only chance. He decided that he had to put the information in the hands of those who really wanted to protect it. Running through the streets of the city resembled a scene from a thriller. He, Marcus, and the lawyers hid in alleys, evaded pursuers, and looked for any way to escape. Suddenly, they saw a familiar figure. It was the woman the teenager had met earlier, the one who had given him the documents. She was walking towards them with a determined face, but people were already gathering around her. The teenager approached her and asked what was going on. She explained that she had found a way to safely pass on the information to independent investigative bodies that could do so. But another obstacle stood in their way. They noticed that they were being watched not only by those who were trying to stop them, but also by people who were part of the system. They soon realized that the lawyers themselves were under threat. Some of them had families who could become targets. The teenager, realizing the gravity of the situation, gathered a team and came up with a plan. They would split up and meet at a specific location where there were independent journalists ready to interview them and publish all the information. It was a risky move, but they had no choice. Not only their lives were at stake, but the lives of many others. Everything went pretty smoothly until they arrived at their destination. When the teenager entered the room, he saw that several journalists were already waiting for him. But then, at the very moment when he began to describe the situation, A group of people they had already seen burst into the room. They were the same men in black. The teenager felt his heart skip a beat as they began to threaten, shouting for everyone to leave. But at that moment, when all seemed lost, another unexpected turn occurred. One of the journalists who was in the room suddenly stood up and announced that he had enough information to call the police. He said that independent human rights organizations were in touch with him and that they were already investigating. These words filled the teenager with hope, but left him in fear. The teenager realized that now was not the time to give up. He said loudly, "We're not just telling a story. We're exposing a criminal network that has been hiding its dark deeds for a long time. And this isn't just my story. This is the story of everyone who suffers from bias and injustice." Hearing his words, the journalists began to record. The men in black looked wary, but at the same time they began to roll back, realizing that their plan was failing. The teenager understood that this was his chance. He showed the documents he had and began to talk about what they had learned about the network, about the corruption, about those who were behind it all. The police unit he was expecting did indeed arrive, and when they entered, the teenager was relieved to see that they included individuals known for their commitment to justice. They quickly assessed the situation and took action. The men in black attempted to resist, but the police acted quickly and professionally, arresting them. It was a moment of triumph, but the teenager knew it was just the beginning. Despite the success, he knew they had a long way to go. After the arrest, many of those involved in the criminal network began to rat on each other, and this became the catalyst for a much wider investigation. It became news, covered by all the major media outlets. But new dangers were on the horizon. Despite the arrests, the teenager and his team knew that the real forces behind the network were not going to give up so easily. The teenager who had become a symbol of the struggle felt that he had an even greater responsibility on his shoulders. He realized that this fight was no longer just about him, but about millions of people suffering from injustice. This realization spurred him into action. Now he had to not only continue his work, but also make sure that such situations never happened again. And although he had opponents, he knew that he had the support of those who really wanted change. Thus, the story that began with one courageous act turned into a fight for truth and justice. The teenager took on the role of a fighter for human rights and was ready to go to the end, despite all the trials he had to overcome. The teenager, now a symbol of the fight against injustice, felt that his life and the lives of his loved ones were at risk. Despite the arrests, he knew that the criminal network he was challenging was too powerful and too cunning. Each day spent in constant anxiety and fear placed a heavy burden of responsibility on him for the fate of others who depended on him. A few days after the arrests, the teenager and his team began receiving threats via anonymous messages. These weren't just empty words. One of the messages included photos of his family taken on the street with the caption, "We are watching you." These threats haunted him, and he knew that the danger was getting closer. The situation escalated when his mother, having learned of what had happened, tried to meet him. She was deeply concerned and could not understand why her son had chosen to take a path full of danger. She increasingly urged him to leave the case, even if it meant giving up, but he was adamant, explaining to her that he could not simply watch this injustice happen and that they had to fight for a better future. But his courage and determination could not protect him from tragedy. One evening, when the teenager returned home from a meeting with lawyers, he noticed that the door to his apartment was slightly open. His heart began to beat faster when he walked inside and saw that the room was in disarray. He immediately rushed to the bedroom, where his mother always sat reading or watching TV, but what he saw left him in shock. She was lying on the floor, unconscious, with a slight blow to her head. The teenager quickly called an ambulance, but while he was waiting, he was overcome by a terrible premonition. Soon, doctors confirmed his fears. She had lost a lot of blood, and, according to doctors, her condition was critical. In the hospital, the teenager couldn't hold back his tears, realizing that his fight could cost him the life that was most dear to him. This was punishment for his actions, and he felt guilty. He kept telling himself that if he had just left things as they were, if he hadn't decided to fight the system, his mother would be safe now. Her condition worsened with each passing day, and the teenager knew he had to do something. He began receiving more threats, and one day, An anonymous number called him. He heard mockery and a threat in the voice that spoke to him. "Your mother will pay for your mistakes. She is a hostage in this game." The teenager felt his heart squeeze with horror. Without waiting for her condition to stabilize, he decided he had to act. He returned to his team, where they began to strategize on how to protect his mother and their own lives, but they also continued to gather information about the criminal network. Marcus, who was still by his side, supported the teenager in his quest for justice, despite his fears and doubts. As the team continued their work, the teenager met with the woman who had initially given him the documents. She helped him understand the situation and gather information. They became closer, and he felt supported and understood by her. She knew what he was going through, and her experience gave him hope. But one night, while they were working on the case, another tragedy occurred. They received information that one of the locations where illegal operations were taking place was spotted in the area where he lived. The teenager decided that he had to go there to see for himself. He couldn't wait any longer, and this might be the chance they needed. As he approached the area where it all happened, the teenager noticed several cars with the same people who had threatened him and his family. His heart began to beat faster, but he knew he couldn't back down. He was going to expose them to save his mother and prevent further tragedies. However, as he got closer, he was caught. He was grabbed and beaten, and his documents were taken. At that moment, he realized that his plan had failed. At that moment, it hit him again. How naive I was. He knew that he couldn't back out, but he also understood that they weren't going to let him go just like that. At that moment, his heart was filled with horror as he realized that they could use him as a hostage to blackmail his team. He heard one of their leaders laughing and threatening his mother, as if he knew he was related to her. The teenager felt like his life was hanging by a thread. He realized that everything he did could end in disaster. Despite his fear, he began to gather the last of his courage to break free from their grasp. He knew that his actions not only affected him, but also his team and his family, but his inner voice still called him to action. He had to save his mother and stop this network once and for all. At this point, his team, noticing his absence, began searching. They couldn't afford to lose him, and they had no choice but to take the risk. They knew the teenager was in danger and that time was running out. The team members gathered everyone who could help and began asking locals about his whereabouts. The situation had reached a critical point. The teenager found himself alone with a criminal network, and he had no way out. He understood that his fate and the fate of his family depended on his courage and determination. Gathering his strength, he decided that he would fight to the end. With each passing moment, he became more and more aware that his fight was not only for him, but for all those who suffered from injustice. He understood that even if he did not survive, he had to do everything in his power to leave his mark and fight this system. Meanwhile, his team sprang into action. They followed leads and searched for him, stopping at nothing. Eventually, they found the place where he was being held, but they arrived in the middle of a fight. It was still very risky, and they knew they couldn't afford to make a mistake. When the teenager started fighting for his freedom, his friends, on the other hand, intervened in the fight to save him. It was a real fight, where the stakes were too high. The tragedy that haunted them could be the end for everyone at this moment, but they knew that this was the only chance. Then, when all seemed lost, there was an unexpected sound, a loud crash of glass. One of the journalists who had been investigating returned with support. They brought with them the police and human rights organizations that had previously helped the teenager. The teenager realized that his struggle had led to this moment. The forces of law and order burst into the building, and the real fight began. The teenager and his team fought together, and although they had to endure many trials, they were still able to stop the criminals and provide protection. But when the dust settled and everyone calmed down, he looked around and saw that his loved ones, especially his mother, were still suffering from the consequences of this fight. The tragedy they faced would forever remain in their hearts, but the teenager realized that their strength was not only in fighting the system, but also in supporting each other in difficult times. He realized that even when the world seemed dark, when justice did not always prevail, they must continue to fight for their dreams and for those who suffer. This fight could become a source of strength and hope that they all so desperately needed. The teenager stood up, realizing that this was not the end. This was only the first battle, but he was ready to continue his war for justice and change this world for the better. The tragedy they had all witnessed made him realize how important this fight was, and he was ready to move forward no matter what. The teenager, still in shock from the aftermath of recent events, stood in front of his home as a team of rescuers helped his mother out of the hospital. He felt the weight of everything that had happened and knew that he still had a lot of work ahead of him. Even though the perpetrators had been arrested, the system they represented remained undefeated. It was a network entrenched in society, and the teenager knew he had to keep fighting. A few days later, his team gathered at a local center to discuss how they could use their story to raise awareness about racism and discrimination. Their goal was not only to get justice for his family, but to protect and help others who were facing similar challenges. The teenager began to realize that his fight was not just a personal matter, but a movement that could inspire many. One day, as the teenager was talking to a group of his friends, they began sharing their own stories of racism and bias they had experienced. One of his friends, a black youth, told of being stopped on the street simply for being black and asked to provide proof of his personal information. This memory evoked strong emotions in everyone. The teenager began to reflect on how deeply and pervasively racism was rooted in their society. With these thoughts in mind, they decided to organize a rally for human rights. It was a decision that could become both a symbol of their struggle and a big target for those who stood on the side of prejudice and hatred. The teenager and his team began preparing for the event, gathering information, designing posters, and planning speeches. He dreamed of how their voices would be heard and how they could make a difference. But with each passing week, the threats they received grew more severe. One day, when the teenager returned home, he noticed that his yard had been spray-painted with offensive graffiti. This wasn't just vandalism, it was a manifestation of the hatred and fear felt by those who fought the system. He knew that his opponents weren't going to give in, and that they would have to be prepared for anything. When the day of the rally arrived, the teenager was determined. He walked onto the stage in front of a crowd of people who had come to support him and his team. He felt this was their moment to make the world pay attention to racism and bias. Listening to the cries of support, he gave a moving speech about his mother, the suffering they had endured, and how racism ruins lives. But soon after the rally began, as emotions were running high, he noticed a group of people standing to the side, dressed in black and holding signs with offensive slogans. They were local radicals who opposed the Black civil rights movement. Their presence was a clear reminder that hatred was still alive, and the teenager felt a growing tension in the air. As the rally continued, radicals began shouting abuse, trying to disrupt the event. The teenager decided he had to stop it and raise his voice to try to calm the crowd, but this only fueled the hatred even more. Soon, a fight broke out, and the teenager realized that the situation was getting out of control. He and his friends who had come to support him became targets. The radicals who rushed to the attack began to threaten, insult, and even push the participants of the rally. The teenager felt fear taking over him, but he knew that he could not retreat. He began to speak even louder, calling for peace and unity, but as he tried to get his message across, the situation worsened. Finally, just when the teenager thought all was lost, his team, including those who had supported them from the start, rushed forward to protect him and the rest of the participants. They formed a chain, trying to divide the crowd. It was a brave move, but it came at a cost. In the chaos, several of his friends were injured, and one of them, standing guard, was badly wounded. The teenager felt his heart sink when he saw his friend fall. He rushed to help him, and at that moment his own life was in danger. He encountered one of the radicals, who was more aggressive than the others. Remembering what happened to his mother and how much suffering hatred had brought, he gathered all his strength and rushed into battle. This wasn't just a physical fight, it was a clash of ideas and ideals. The teenager, in addition to the physical struggle, was screaming about the importance of promoting love and understanding, not hate. He understood that this wasn't just his fight, but the fight of everyone who had ever faced racism and prejudice. This internal conflict, full of drama and passion, became his strength. Luckily, the police, having received signals about the disturbance, arrived on the scene and were able to quickly disperse the crowd. They began to detain the radicals, and this helped the teenager and his friends get rid of danger. But the story did not end there. The injuries sustained by his friend were serious, and the teenager felt his heart breaking with guilt. He knew that their actions were aimed at protecting themselves, but the result was tragic. The next day, as the teenager sat next to his friend in the hospital, he thought about how deeply ingrained racism was in their community. He knew they had to keep fighting, no matter the risks, and that their actions mattered. But the bitterness of seeing his friend hurt lingered. It was a reminder that fighting for justice could cost lives and limbs. As the weeks passed, the teenager continued to work with lawyers and advocacy groups to bring about change, but he also tried to support his team, especially those who had been traumatized, and help them cope with the consequences of their actions. It wasn't easy, and he felt the pressure mounting. One day, during a meeting with a human rights group, the teenager received news that his friend had been released from the hospital. It was a welcome relief, but the joy soon gave way to anxiety. The friend admitted that he did not feel safe. And, what's more, he began receiving threats from those involved in the attack. The news left the teenager deeply shaken. He realized that despite all their efforts, the hatred and prejudice were still there, ready to strike again. He knew he had to do something. This time, he envisioned a support organization for victims of racism and bias, where people could share their stories and get help. But the more he worked, the clearer it became that society was divided, and his struggle was just the tip of the iceberg. The teenager realized that this was not just his personal struggle, but a challenge for the entire society. He needed to unite people, regardless of their race or background, to fight against injustice together. Soon he organized the first public forum, where people from different walks of life gathered. They discussed issues related to racism, bias and discrimination, and began to develop strategies to unite and fight for justice. The teenager felt that this was his chance to change the world. However, he soon encountered a new obstacle. Local authorities began to put pressure on his organization, accusing it of inciting hatred and unrest. It was a shocking discovery. The teenager could not believe that instead of supporting him, they were persecuting him for his desire to make society better. This became a serious test for his team, but they were not going to give up. Despite the threats, the teenager continued to speak out. His confidence grew each day as he saw more and more people joining their movement. They began holding protests, educational workshops, and raising funds to help those who had suffered from racism. His friendships with other activists grew stronger, and they became a family, supporting each other through difficult times. With each passing day, the teenager realized that his struggle was not only his own story, but also the story of many others who were struggling with the same demons. He became a symbol of hope and change, inspiring others to follow his example and stand up to racism and hatred. With each new challenge and obstacle, he became stronger and more determined. He knew that despite the tragedies they faced, they could change the world if they fought together. His story, the story of his mother and friend, and everyone who had ever faced bias, was becoming a powerful force for change. The teenager who was once an ordinary boy was now the voice of a generation seeking justice, and he was willing to continue his fight, no matter the odds, knowing that this was his path to liberation and that they could change this world for the better. The teenager who became a symbol of the fight against racism and injustice continued to move forward with unwavering determination. His organization became a center of activism, and he attracted more and more people who wanted to be part of the movement. But as in any struggle, successes came hand in hand with new challenges and dangers. Despite the growing popularity of their actions, the situation in society became increasingly tense. The teenager and his team faced constant pressure from local authorities, who began to openly oppose their actions. Unjust arrests of participants in the actions, the threat of closing their organization, all this only fueled the determination of the teenager and his friends. One night, while he was working on a new event, his phone rang. It was his friend who had been injured during the rally. He was panicking and reporting that someone had tried to set his house on fire. The teenager, feeling his heart pounding, gathered his team and rushed to the scene. When they arrived, smoke was already rising from the building. Firefighters were trying to put out the flames, and police had cordoned off the scene. The teenager was horrified to see his friend losing everything he had. He immediately went to his friend, hugged him, and tried to console him. "We're going to get through this, bro. We're not going to let them break us," he assured him, even though he felt like the ground was slipping out from under his feet. The situation that had developed was yet another wake-up call that their fight for justice would not go unpunished. After this incident, the teenager decided that they should join forces and push for change not only at the local government level, but also at a higher level. He began planning a large rally that would attract the attention of not only local but also national media. Preparations for the rally were difficult. They worked tirelessly, creating posters, rehearsing speeches, and recruiting participants, but the teenager felt the pressure mounting. He knew he was risking not only his reputation, but the safety of his friends and family. He also worried about his mother, who was still recovering from injuries she had suffered earlier. On the day of the rally, his fears were confirmed. The crowd was full of people ready to support their cause, but there was a group of radicals standing next to them ready to cause trouble. The teenager stood on the stage and gave his speech, calling for unity and love. He spoke about the importance of supporting each other in these dark times and how we must unite against hatred. When he finished, a group of people supporting him came out on stage. Soon, the radicals began shouting insults and provocations. The teenager understood that this could be the beginning of a new conflict and tried to calm the crowd, but his words were met with a roar of hatred. And then, when the situation started to escalate, the teenager saw his friend, who had been attacked in the past, standing there, furious, ready to retaliate. The teenager rushed towards him, knowing that the conflict could end badly. "Don't let them provoke you into a conflict. We are stronger when we are together," he shouted, trying to keep his friend from getting angry. But at that moment, something unexpected happened. The crowd of radicals began to attack, and the clash erupted with renewed vigor. The police, who were on the scene, did not know how to react to what was happening. The entire rally became an arena of violence, and the teenager found himself at the center of a stormy ocean of hatred and fear. A full-scale fight broke out. People who had come to support the movement were confronted by radicals who were trying to break their spirit. The teenager, seeing his friends in distress, rushed into the fight. He felt the fire burning inside him, and his heart was pounding with adrenaline, but he knew that this was not a solution. The conflict was becoming more dangerous with each passing minute. Finally, the teenager realized that the only way to stop this violence was to call for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. He climbed onto a nearby platform so that everyone could see him. "Listen to me. We are not here to fight each other. We are here to fight for justice," he shouted, trying to get his words across to the angry crowd. At that moment, when hatred could have consumed everyone, something changed. Some of the radicals began to stop when they heard his words. The teenager continued to talk about unity and hope, about how violence would not lead to anything good. He spoke of love that unites people despite their differences. Despite the horror unfolding around them, his words began to resonate. The crowd, gradually calming down, began to listen. It was a striking sight, two opposing camps, clashing in one place, but seemingly beginning to realize that they were separated only by fear and hatred. Among the radicals, there was one man who spoke most vocally. He paused, unsure how to respond to the call for peace. This man, who had once been the subject of prejudice and racism, was vulnerable. The teenager saw doubt and fear in his eyes, and it gave him new strength. He stepped toward him, and when their eyes met, he began to speak. "We are all human beings here. We all deserve respect and understanding. How can we change this world if we continue to hate each other?" This was a turning point. People began to understand that they could fight for their rights without resorting to violence. One by one, the radicals began to leave, but the teenager knew that this was only the beginning. They would still have to work on their prejudices and fears. When the conflict finally died down and silence hung in the air, the teenager realized that they had achieved something important. It was not just a victory over hatred, but a step toward healing. He knew that there was still much work ahead, and they had to work together to change society. With this determination, the teenager gathered his team and everyone who was with them at the rally. He He knew that their actions were important not only for them, but for future generations. Together, they decided to continue their fight, spreading awareness about racism, bias, and hatred, and creating a platform for everyone who wanted to be heard. And although they knew that difficult trials lay ahead, the teenager was sure that together they could achieve justice. This was their battle, and he was ready to fight for it to the end. They took on the responsibility of changing the world, and he understood that this was only the beginning of their journey. Despite the successful rally and first movement for peace, the teenager's life was still full of challenges. He continued to lead his organization, but the pressure from radicals and local authorities only increased. Unable to take action on the streets, the teenager and his team decided to focus on training and education. They organized seminars and workshops, inviting experts who could share their experiences in combating racism and bias. But as soon as they started gaining popularity, they started receiving threats. The teenager received insulting messages in his email, saying they were inciting hatred. He knew it was just an attempt to intimidate him and his team, but his anxiety grew with each passing day, and when he finally decided to go to the police, his statements seemed to have no effect. The police responded that they could not interfere in civilian affairs. One night, as the teenager was walking home, he noticed that he was being followed. Feeling uneasy, he quickened his pace, but as he turned a corner, 3 hooded men emerged from the shadows and surrounded him. One of them stepped forward and said, smirking, "We've been looking for you, hero. You seem to have forgotten that not everyone agrees with your ideas." The teenager, standing in danger, felt fear creeping up on him, but he couldn't afford to show weakness. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, trying to sound confident. At that moment, one of the attackers jumped forward and pushed him. The teenager flew back and fell to the ground. Thoughts flashed through his mind that if they didn't stop, this could end badly. But when he got up, he suddenly heard a scream coming from around the corner. It was his friend, the same one who had been wounded at the rally. He seemed to recognize him and rushed into the fight, trying to protect the teenager. For a moment, the teenager was stunned. He thought his friend had recovered and was now with him again, but now he had to fight the same enemies. The fight was fast and brutal. The teenager and his friend fought together, but the attackers were outnumbered. Finally, when it seemed they couldn't hold on, sirens suddenly sounded. It was the police, who finally decided to intervene. The attackers, realizing they were being caught, fled, leaving the teenager and his friend lying on the ground, breathing heavily. At the hospital, where the teenager and his friend received medical care, another shock awaited them. During an examination, the doctor informed the teenager that his friend had suffered serious injuries and might be transferred to intensive care. This was a real shock for the teenager, who had already lost so much. He felt guilty and helpless, since it was his struggle that had led to this. His friend's condition continued to deteriorate, and the teenager, filled with grief and fear, decided that he could not just sit back. He reached out to his acquaintances, activists and friends, and they decided to hold a rally in support of his friend. It was to be an event to show that they would not give up, and that the fight for justice would continue. At the rally, which drew a large crowd, the teenager spoke again. He spoke about how racism and bias affect people's lives and how important it is to support each other. He called on everyone to come together despite threats and violence. But this time, when he spoke, he felt like his words mattered more than ever. Just when it seemed like they were on the right track, there was an unexpected turn of events. The same man who had threatened a teenager earlier showed up at the rally, but he was now dressed in more formal attire. He was a local politician trying to drum up support from his constituents. He approached the teenager and said, "I see how you're struggling, and I want to offer my help. We have a lot in common." These words caused a storm of emotions in the crowd. The teenager felt anger and distrust wash over him. He remembered how this man had promoted racism and prejudice in the past. "Why are you here? Do you want to exploit our pain for your own gain?" The teenager responded, looking at him with disdain. The politician tried to justify himself, but the crowd, beginning to realize his true intentions, began to shout insults. At that moment, the teenager realized that his job was not only to confront hatred, but also to expose the hypocrisy of those who try to exploit disasters for their own gain. The situation escalated, and at this point his friend, despite his condition, managed to speak on stage with his last strength. "Don't let them use our history for their own purposes. We are not fighting to make it easier for someone in the elections. We want justice," he said, causing delight and support from the crowd. The situation became critical. The politician, realizing that his plan was falling apart, tried to leave, but the teenager and his friends surrounded him, demanding honesty and sincerity. "If you really want to help, start by admitting that your policies breed hatred and prejudice," the teenager shouted, his voice resonating in the air. Eventually, the politician walked away and the crowd began to disintegrate. The teenager felt mixed emotions. On the one hand, they had achieved something important, but on the other, the fight was far from over. That evening, sitting in the hospital next to his friend, who was still in intensive care, he couldn't help but think about how hard it was for all of them. As the days turned into weeks, his friend's condition continued to worsen. The teenager felt increasingly powerless. He couldn't sleep, tormented by the thought that he might not be able to save his friend, and his actions could cost them both their lives. On one of those sleepless nights, he decided to take another step. He called his supporters and organized a fundraising campaign for his friend's family to help them cover their medical expenses. It was not only a help, but also a way to show that they were still united despite all the difficulties. However, the next day, when the teenager came to the hospital, he was faced with more bad news. His friend had passed away. This moment was a real tragedy for him and his team. The teenager felt his world crumbling. He understood that this was not just a loss, it was the loss of a symbol of their struggle, and he did not know how to continue. Despite the grief and pain, the teenager decided that he couldn't let this tragedy stop him. He gathered his supporters and gave a speech in which he spoke about his friend's courage and resilience, and how he inspired them all. He encouraged everyone to continue the fight for justice and to create a foundation in his friend's honor to help others who have faced racism and bias. The loss, though devastating, was a catalyst for the teenager. He knew his friend had left a legacy, and he had a responsibility to continue it. He organized a benefit concert that featured many local performers, with the proceeds going to support victims of racism. The concert was a success, and the teenager felt that he had found a new meaning in life. He knew that his friend might not be with him physically, but his spirit lived on in their struggle. This new stage in their lives was an important milestone, and he realized that even in the darkest times, there is a place for light. With each passing day, the teenager realized more and more that his fight was not only for himself and his friends, but for all those who had ever been oppressed and humiliated. He began to conduct educational programs, drawing attention to the problems of racism and bias, and doing everything he could to change the world for the better. Along with his activism, other changes were happening in his life. He began to spend more time with his family, the loved ones who had supported him through difficult times. These were people who had also experienced their share of suffering, and together they were creating a new front to combat bias, based on love and understanding. With each new project, with each performance, he felt his spirit grow stronger. He became not only a leader of the movement, but also a voice for many who fought racism. It was a new beginning, full of hopes and dreams for a brighter future, where equality and justice would be the norm, not the exception. So the teenager went from being an ordinary boy who had faced the horrors of racism to a true fighter for justice who was not afraid to defend his loved ones and those who suffered from bias. And although the road ahead was full of difficulties, he knew that with each step they were getting closer to their goal. He understood that his life had changed forever, and he was ready to fight for a world in which his friend, his family, and everyone who had ever faced hatred could live in safety and dignity. The teenager who became a symbol of the fight against racism continued his activism, but his life and emotions became more complex. He realized that while his activism was bringing results, it was also causing him physical and emotional exhaustion. Each new event required energy, but each victory gave him hope and strength. He realized that his work was not just a project, but a part of his life. One evening, while preparing for a new action, the teenager met a young woman named Maya, who came to help. Maya was a passionate activist and ran her own project to support young people suffering from bias. She told him about her life, how she lost her brother in a racist attack, and how this event made her become an activist. They quickly hit it off, and their friendship began to deepen. But despite the support of his friends and new allies, new problems were brewing in the teenager's life. His parents were finding it hard to cope with his activism. They worried about his safety and health. Every time he came home with bruises or stories of violence at protests, their fears grew. They told him that he needed to think about his life and the consequences of his actions. One day, after a particularly intense event, the teenager returned home with a severe headache and a feeling of utter exhaustion. He was so exhausted that he couldn't immediately respond when his mother asked how the event had gone. Finally, he blurted out, "We did it. We got a lot of people together, but it all seems so pointless. I'm not sure we made a difference." His mother, seeing his despair, hugged him. "Sometimes changes take time, and every action you take matters. You are a light in the darkness for many, and that is very important." These words calmed the teenager down a little, but he still felt like he was on the edge of an abyss. Soon after, he learned of an upcoming human rights conference that many well-known activists and academics were invited to. This was a great opportunity for him to introduce his organization and its goals to a wider audience. He decided that this could be the next step that would help him regain his confidence. However, on the eve of the conference, something unexpected happened. One of his old enemies, who had initially threatened him, decided to make his own statement. A video appeared on social media in which the man accused the teenager of using racism as a means of attracting attention to himself and that his actions only served to divide society. The video quickly went viral, and hateful and insulting comments poured into the teenager's page. He was desperate. The knowledge that his enemies could influence public opinion gave him new cause for concern. He had had the opportunity to speak at the conference, but now he felt that his voice had been taken away. His friends tried to support him, but his heart remained heavy. He did not know how to resist this pressure. The next morning, just before the conference, the teenager received a message from Maya. She offered him support and told him he shouldn't let his enemies take his voice away. "You are not alone, and you matter to many. Remember, you are not just fighting for yourself, you are fighting for all of us," she wrote. With her encouragement, he decided he couldn't give up. At the conference, he gave a speech based on his own experiences. He spoke about racism, how it affects people's lives, and the importance of being brave and open despite bias and hatred. His words resonated in the room, and he saw many people throwing looks of support. After the speech, he felt a surge of strength and confidence, but as soon as he left the hall, he was met by a group of journalists ready to interview him. They asked him questions about his views on racism, his experiences, and how he copes with pressure. The teenager was ready to share his thoughts and feelings, but at some point, he was again faced with hate comments. At that moment, he remembered the words of Maya and all those who supported him. He said, "Yes, I have enemies, but that does not define me. I continue to fight because I believe in justice. I believe that our voice can change the world." These words were remembered by many, and soon his speech went around the internet, collecting positive responses. However, things were not so smooth in the teenager's personal life. Tensions arose within his family. His parents were still worried about his safety, and their fears were heightened when they saw him on the news. They could not understand why he continued to risk his life to fight. One evening, after he returned from yet another event, his mother told him in a rage, "You don't take care of yourself anymore. You don't think about us, about what we go through when we see you on screen or hear about violence on the streets." These words struck him in the heart. The teenager began to wonder if it was really worth continuing his fight if it was causing such damage to his family. He felt torn between two worlds, between his duty to himself and his duty to his family. With tears in his eyes, he ran to his room, trying to sort out his feelings. The next morning, after much thought, the teenager made a decision. He gathered a team of activists and told them about his experiences. He decided to temporarily pause his activities to spend time with his family and try to repair his relationships. He knew that this was not just a question of how to be an activist, but a question of how to be a human being. But even as he tried to focus on his family, he couldn't forget about his responsibilities. Maya continued to inspire him, and they stayed in touch. She offered to help him organize events for the family so that other parents could understand what their children were doing and why it was important. The teenager thought this could be the bridge that would connect him and his parents to his activist life. When they held their first meeting, where parents and activists could talk openly about their worries and hopes, the teenager felt all the pieces of his life coming together. People shared their stories, and he saw how many parents were worried about their children, that their lives could be at risk because of racism. This meeting marked the beginning of a new stage in his life. He realized that the fight against racism and prejudice is not only the work of activists, but also the work of every person. He learned to listen and support others, and this gave him new strength. Despite all the difficulties, the teenager was able to create a project that united his family and his activism. They began organizing family events where parents could talk about their fears and children could share their hopes. The process became healing not only for him, but for everyone involved. And while the fight against racism was still a part of his life, he learned to balance his responsibilities as an activist with his family obligations. With each new encounter, he realized that his fight was not just a personal story, but the story of many people who want change. The teenager continued to work on his organization, but now with renewed strength and awareness. He knew that this was his path, and that he was not alone. He was surrounded by friends, family, and those who believed in his ideas. With each step, he was closer to his dream of a world free of hatred and prejudice, and he was ready to move forward, despite any difficulties. As time went on, the teenager gained more confidence and understanding of his role in society. His projects to unite families and activists began to bear fruit. A new generation of people grew up in the city where he lived, ready to actively fight racism and prejudice. The events he organized became more and more popular, and his voice became louder. A few months after organizing family meetings, the teenager received an invitation to an important human rights forum. The event brought together movement leaders, local politicians, and prominent activists to discuss how to improve life in communities facing racism and discrimination. When it was his turn to speak, the teenager walked onto the stage. Determined, he began by talking about his family and the importance of support and understanding. He then shared his experience of how activism can change people's lives when they work together. We cannot remain silent. We must unite to create a world where every person is valued and respected. Our strength lies in unity, he exclaimed, and the room burst into applause. At this forum, he met people from other cities and even countries who were inspired by his story. They exchanged contacts and ideas, and the teenager realized that his influence extended far beyond his hometown. He returned home filled with inspiration and energy for new beginnings. After some time, his organization began collaborating with other groups that were fighting racism and bias. Together, they developed an action plan to improve life in their community. The teenager and his team organized large events where families could gather, share experiences, and learn from each other. Soon, his organization became known at the state level, and their projects attracted the attention of local media. The teenager began appearing on television and radio, sharing his ideas and talking about the problems people were facing. His words inspired many, and even those who had previously had no interest in racism joined the movement. In the end, the teenager was awarded for his achievements and contribution to the fight for equality. At the awards ceremony, he felt his heart fill with pride for everything they had done. When he walked onto the stage to accept the award, he saw his family and Maya in the audience. Their support meant everything to him. "This award is not just mine," he said into the microphone. "This is an award for all those who fight for justice. We did it together, and together we will continue." The audience burst into applause, and the teenager felt his dreams were becoming reality. The following year, his hometown hosted a week of tolerance, with lectures, workshops, and cultural events. People of all races and nationalities came to learn and share experiences. It became a symbol of unity and hope. The teenager also created a foundation in his friend's honor to help young people who have suffered from racism and provide them with opportunities to learn and grow. He knew his friend would be proud of him and would support the initiative. With each new achievement, he felt that his life was changing. His parents, seeing how he inspired others, began to be proud of who he had become. They became actively involved in his projects, and this brought them closer together as a family. They became best friends, and every evening they would gather together, discussing the past day and sharing their hopes for the future. He also began to build a strong relationship with May. She became his rock and support, and together they dreamed of a future where racism and hatred would not exist. The teenager realized that he not only had a goal, but also people who were ready to support him along the way. A few years later, the teenager graduated with honors and received a scholarship to attend university. He chose a major in human rights and was determined to continue his fight at the next level. He knew that education would give him the tools he needed to make an even greater impact on society. At his graduation ceremony, when he received his diploma, he looked around at his friends, family, and allies. He realized that the path he had taken had been filled with hardships, but also incredible victories. He dreamed of a future where everyone would have equal opportunities and where his work would continue through a new generation of activists. The bright future he dreamed of became more and more real, and as he left university, he knew that his fight was just beginning. The teenager turned young leader understood that every step, every voice, and every action mattered. He continued to move forward, inspired by his purpose and surrounded by those who made his life brighter and more meaningful. So the story of a teenager who walked into a fire station with a blanket ended on a note of hope and unity. He became a symbol of the fight for justice that inspired many, and his message lived on, changing the world for the better. Thank you for staying with us and following this inspiring story. We would love to hear your thoughts on this story. Have you had any experiences of racism in your life? How did you deal with these situations? Your thoughts and experiences are very important to us, and we appreciate each and every one of you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video if you enjoyed it. Your likes and subscriptions help us continue to share important stories and build a community where every voice matters. Have a great day! Remember, your story matters.